the tango.
I like Mafalda because she's always curious and she thinks about the future. And she understands a lot of complicated stuff.
She hates soup, loves the Beatles, questions authority, and appeals to people across countries and generations.
Yo nací en un conventillo de la calle Olavarría. De la calle Olavarría.
Mafalda, Quino's beloved comic strip from Argentina, first published in the 60s, has conquered the world for so many years, appearing in at least 25 languages.
One where Mafalda asked his dad, are we poor or rich? And then he said, no, we're in the middle class. And then he tried to say, was it worth it being in the middle? Yeah, that's what she said.
6 decades on, she is finally reaching audiences in the United States, translated into English for the first time. If you know Mafalda, you know that she's only 6 years old, but somehow always manages to ask the questions that live in our minds. You just heard our host Karen's kids, Nico and Eleni, telling us about Mafalda. Now, Aime Iglesias Lukin, America Society Chief Art Curator, grew up in Argentina and can tell us more.
Growing up in Argentina, Mafalda is an unescapable reference. And Mafalda had this universal appeal of a product of, of a group of friends, a group of kids that were discussing topics of adults in their own right. And to have the reference of a young girl who had opinions about things, who had positions, who was curious, who made questions, where that was a value, that was huge.
Hi, this is Luisa Leme with ASCOA Online. Welcome back to Latin American Focus. Today I'm talking with award-winning Irish translator Frank Wynne, who's working on all 5 volumes of Quino's Mafalda's stories, translating our Heroine for English-speaking audiences.
While Mafalda is not talking about the specificities of what's going on in Argentina, right now, this minute, politically, she is talking about what freedom is, what censorship is. There is, volume 3 or thereabouts, Mafalda is walking down the street and there is graffiti on the wall that is supposed to say, down with censorship, abajo la censura. But it just says, abajo la because actually there is a policeman chasing the graffiti artist. And so you're commenting on censorship. So all of these things were important.
We talk about why Mafalda is an icon, Quino's genius in publishing the strip cartoon during coups in Argentina, and how Mafalda remains a great companion for all of us in 2025. This episode is our summer recommendation for anyone who wants to understand Latin America. We will take a quick break after this until September, when we will be back with more episodes. Don't forget to send this to a friend who likes comic books but doesn't read Spanish and despises soup as much as authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina en Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Frank Wynne, thank you so much for coming to Latin American Focus. Welcome to our podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I expect that our listeners probably know who Mafalda is, but since the goal here for this podcast is always to explain the region, to introduce Latin America, I'm going to start by asking you, who is Mafalda?
Mafalda is a strip cartoon by Quino, which he began drawing in 1964 and which he went on to draw for 9 years. She's from Buenos Aires. She lives with her mother and her father. And the thing with Mafalda is she is a smart 6-year-old who is very curious about the world and asks an awful lot of questions, frequently about topics that nobody can explain to her. War, peace, illness, famine, poverty, democracy, communism. These are big questions, and Mafalda wants to understand them. But mostly, she has to figure them out for herself because her parents can't answer them, and nobody else seems to be able to answer them. She manages to remain 6 all her life, despite the fact that at some point she gets a little brother, and Guillaume grows up to be 4, but she's still 6. And of course, Mafalda was being drawn in Argentina at a point when Argentina was in a relatively difficult position. I mean, there had been a coup just before this happened. There was a coup during the publication of Mafalda, and of course, just after Quino stopped drawing it, there was another coup in 1976, at which point Quino left Argentina and went to live in Europe and was there until 1983.
You were a translator from French and Spanish, and I learned that you also translated comics before. How did you encounter Mafalda?
So I first encountered Mafalda not in Spanish at all, but in French. When I was living in France in the 1980s, I discovered Mafalda and I read all of Mafalda. And then I went looking for a translation of Mafalda into English so that I could give it to my friends. And I was very surprised to discover that it didn't exist. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, when you talk about strip cartoons, and this is a different thing from comics, strip cartoons are 3-4 panels. They would normally appear in a newspaper every day or every week.
Okay.
And so it's not a continuous story. But I think there are 3 that are definitive. And they are Charles Schulz's Peanuts, which did influence Quino when he began to draw Mafalda, Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes, and Mafalda. So I was familiar with Mafalda, therefore, for a long time, and long before I began to translate from Spanish, because I initially started out as a translator from French, as you said. I began by translating what we now call graphic novels, but also some strip cartoons, some humor, etc. I worked for a time in the comics industry as a publisher, and I even actually managed to publish 2 or 3 strips of Mafalda in the 1990s. I became a full-time translator in the early 2000s, and I discovered that A, I couldn't afford to live in Europe, and B, I didn't really want to. So I moved originally to Costa Rica, where I was for about 2 years. Then I lived in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, for a couple of years. And basically I spent about 10 years, all told, living in various parts of Latin America. And that's when I learned Spanish. I literally went to Latin America with the lyrics to La Bamba. After about 10 years, I also then began translating from Spanish. I've translated authors from Mexico, from Cuba. By the time I was leaving Costa Rica and going to live in Argentina, I sort of spoke Spanish and I thought I'll be fine. And then I got to Buenos Aires and discovered that no one can understand what they're saying because, of course, the Porteño Spanish is very different. It has an accent midway between Italian and Portuguese. They pronounce double L as sh rather than y, and there's all this vos and sos, and then you have all of the slang that comes with it. But I'd been translating therefore from Spanish for about 10 years, and I'd never done any Spanish comics. And I had reread Mafalda then while I was living in Latin America. And of course, there are lots of things that Quino doesn't need to do in his originals. Nowhere in the entirety of Mafalda does he ever mention that they are in Argentina or that they are in Buenos Aires. And there are lots of contextual things about government, about currency, about things that his readers, of course, would take absolutely for granted, but which in French, to some extent, and also in English, once I got around to translating it, there are times that I have to be careful to let people know where we are.
Right.
Because there's a tendency, particularly Anglophone readers think it's all about them. They think that English is the center of the universe, and therefore this little girl is obvious, she's either American or she's British or she's whatever. So why don't I understand, what she's talking about? Yeah, look, not everything is about you. You need to understand that other countries produce culture that is as important and possibly more significant. And I suppose reading it again when I was living in Buenos Aires, you realize that on the one hand, Mafalda is profoundly influenced by the politics of Argentina in the 50s and 60s. But also, Mafalda is profoundly influential on not just the politics of Argentina, but of Latin America more generally, as a sort of symbol of freedom, as a symbol of those who are prepared to question dictatorial regimes. And it's not as though there weren't enough of them to go round.
Right.
Although Mafalda was published in Argentina, Mafalda was banned in Chile under the dictatorship. And in the 60s and 70s in Franco's Spain, you could buy Mafalda as a book, but there was a little sticker on it that said, solo para adultos, adults only.
Oh, wow.
We don't want to be corrupting children with these dangerous ideas of a 6-year-old.
Wow. This is so interesting. I was going to ask you a little bit about translating comics or, as you said, the strip cartoons. What do you love about that? Probably is so different from translating a novel.
It's very interesting. Strip cartoons, it's like the shortest short story possible. It is 3, maybe 4 frames. And each strip has to work on its own. In a graphic novel, you have time to build things out. If I cannot say this in this speech balloon, I can mention it later. In a novel, if I'm translating a sentence, then if I need to, I can take a little bit more time, or I can adjust it so that it fits to how I want it. In a strip cartoon, I have the images that are there, the words. Quino has already drawn the speech balloons, the little bubbles. So my text has to fit in there comfortably. Now, with Mafalda, you will frequently find that a story will continue for a while. When she becomes obsessed with space travel, that goes on for a while. Or when she thinks she's telepathic, that goes on for 6 or 7 strips. But each of those strips, you need to be able to read on its own, and it needs to work. Because, of course, these didn't first appear in books. They appeared in a weekly magazine. So you were only getting this one strip every week. So if it didn't make you laugh, or it didn't make you think, or it didn't make you cry, then actually it's not doing its job. And then translating anything, whether it is a novel or a graphic novel or a strip cartoon, you need to preserve a sense of place. So you can't change Mafalda so that she's British or American, or that she lives somewhere else. It's where she lives is absolutely crucial to who she is, to who her family is. I mean, the various characters in Mafalda are embedded in Argentinian culture, that actually, if you have a girlfriend who's a bit snobby and likes money and whatever, you will say, eres muy Susanita vos. Susanita is the woman who wants to grow up like her mother, to be a member of the jockey club and to play bridge and to have a son who will grow up to be a doctor. And so all of these things are important, but that means that there are times when I have to remind readers or let readers know where we are. For example, there's a strip where Mafalda and Manolito and Felipe are playing government. Now, obviously, if they're going to play government, Mafalda is the president, because she's clever.
Because that's Mafalda.
Because that's Mafalda. Now, most of the jokes about government are fine, and they translate perfectly naturally. Her mother comes in and says, "What are you playing?" She says, "Oh, we're playing government." And she said, "Well, you just don't get into any trouble." And Mafalda says, "Oh, no, we've got lots of policies, but we don't actually do anything." Which is a lovely comment on government, but it's a lovely comment on any government.
Right.
But the sequence ends when Manolito and Felipe arrive in the presidential office and say, "This is a coup d'etat." And Mafalda, rather than, says, "Get out." And in Spanish, they just say, "That's not how we do things." I have to say in English, "That's not how we do things in Argentina, Madam President." Because, of course, I mean, Britain has never had a coup d'etat. America has never had a coup d'etat. It's important to remind people that actually, not just for Quino, but for Mafalda, she lived through 2 coups d'etats, a failed coup d'etat, and the beginnings of coup d'etat, all while being 6 years old. So these were things that she and her friends knew about. And then there are the fact that quite a lot of strip cartoons are about playing the play between word and image. And that's a lovely thing to do. But that means that there is quite a lot of wordplay, there is quite a lot of punning, and these are things that don't translate.
I was going to ask you this. What worried about? What was the difficult part here, and what you were worried about? Like, this is going to get lost in the translation.
Okay, so there is a 3-panel strip where Mama has just given Mafalda some milk. And Mafalda says, so here you have nata, there's cream sitting on the top of my
Right.
milk. You never check before you give it to me. Or are you against controlling creaminess? But natalidad, of course, doesn't mean that. It means birth. And so
It's the
el
birth
control de
rate.
la natalidad means birth control. And of course, birth control is a very big subject in the 1960s. So Mafalda doesn't realize that she's talking about birth control. She thinks that she's talking about cream. But actually, the reader knows that the nata at the beginning, which is cream, and I can't do this because it can't be cream because there's no way to turn cream into birth control. It
Right.
doesn't work. So I have the same panels. Mafalda is there with her little bowl. Then she
Right.
turns to the side and talks to her mother. And then she says something else. So I decided that this is not cold milk. This is hot milk.
Okay.
Because actually, if you leave hot milk, it gets a little
Yeah.
skin on it.
Uh-huh.
And she says, Mama, there's skin on my hot milk. Do you even check before you serve it to me? Or aren't you worried about skinheads? Now, skinheads, of course, is about a completely different concern in the 1960s, about fascism, about the hard right wing in various countries. And again, Mafalda doesn't know that she's talking about that. She still thinks she's talking about the skin that forms on the milk. But that allows me to recreate the joke. It's still about milk, and it still has a payoff, but the payoff can't be about birth control anymore.
That's fascinating, Frank. When I listen to you, I think about Quino, as you say, like Mafalda doesn't know, the reader knows. That's what Quino wants the reader to know.
Yeah.
And then I think him about not as only as a comic artist, but as an Argentine writer, right? And this work is political and it's full of humor. And I wonder, how did that change, let's say in Argentina or in Latin America, the comic tradition or the strip cartoons? How did that change after Quino started writing Mafalda?
Interestingly, in the 60s, Mafalda was probably the only form of writing that was directly critical of government. Now, of course, the governments are never mentioned, the presidents are never mentioned, the parties are never mentioned. But simply by asking the questions, Mafalda is directly questioning an authoritarian government. In 1966, the day after the coup d'etat, on the front page of, I don't remember which newspaper, which again could not publish an editorial criticizing the coup d'etat, there is a 1-panel cartoon of Mafalda just sitting there, looking sad. And she said, so, everything they taught us at school, it was all lies. And that is a real criticism of what has just happened. Her dreams have been shattered by what has happened. All the things that she was taught about freedom, all the things that she was taught about freedom of the press and freedom of speech and all of these things, it was all lies. What it allowed for was a subtle satirical criticism of government, usually disguised as humor. But even then, by the time Quino is coming to the end of doing it, so just before the 1976 coup, it's becoming dangerous. I mean, originally, when he was asked why he stopped drawing Mafalda in 73, he said, I mean, as Bill Watterson said when he stopped drawing Calvin and Hobbes, and Bill is still alive and he still draws stuff, but he doesn't draw Calvin and Hobbes. And what they both said was, I don't want this to get stale. I don't want to repeat the same ideas over and over again. But later, Quino said, actually, if I'd kept drawing Mafalda, I would have been arrested. Because both of his publishers were arrested. Various people that he had worked with in Argentina before he left were arrested. One of the saddest things is that one of the questions that people regularly asked Quino was, so what do you think Mafalda would have been when she grows up? And Mafalda, of course, wants to join the United Nations and work for peace and be an interpreter and be a yada yada. And Quino said, she would have been among the desaparecidos. She would have disappeared with all of the others who were thrown out of airplanes and helicopters and disappeared during the Black Decade. And she probably would have. And certainly Libertad, the character who comes in much, much later, and where Mafalda is actually trying, has an enormous maternal role in this. But what you do get, I mean, certainly within Argentina, you get who is a graphic novelist and whose Peramus is an extraordinary indictment of autocracy and dictatorship and whatever. Now, it is not remotely in the style of what Quino is doing, but it is made possible because Quino was prepared to do this. While Mafalda is not talking about the specificities of what's going on in Argentina, right now, this minute, politically, she is talking about what freedom is, what censorship is. There is, in volume 3 or thereabouts, there is, Mafalda is walking down the street and there is graffiti on the wall that is supposed to say, down with censorship, abajo la censura. But it just says, abajo la because actually there is a policeman chasing the graffiti artist. And so you're commenting on censorship while being, yeah. So all of these things were important. And I mean, when Mafalda is trying to understand as a 6-year-old what the war in Vietnam means, and of course for a child now, or even for when you were growing up reading Mafalda, or when, anyone who was born in the 70s, 80s, they may not know what the Vietnam War was, but they understand the concept of war, and they understand that going to your father and say, Papa, can you explain the mess in Vietnam to me? And he just passes out because it's too complicated. And at some point he finally relents and he says, okay, I'm going to tell you about the mess in Vietnam, but you're not going to understand it. She said, yeah, because I'm stupid. And he says, no, because it's complicated and it's only for grown-ups and whatever. And she says, maybe you could leave out the rude words and all the naughty bits. Because she assumes that if only adults can understand it, it must have something to do with sex. It must have something to do with what he really means, of course, is that he doesn't understand it. Not really. It's all much too complicated. And all of the things that Mafalda wants to know about are too complicated.
Is that how Mafalda stands the test of time? The context is there, but it's never so explained in the story. Is that what it's universal about Mafalda?
Well, what's universal is that small, sassy children are always funny, but also the questions that children ask, and in fact, the questions that adults ask. And Mafalda's first audience would all have been adults. She would be read in a newspaper. And this means that there are some of the jokes which children sort of get, but don't quite get. But actually, children are clever. I mean, I've always felt that if you write for children, you do not write down to them. They understand when parents are trying to fudge and to avoid a question, and they understand why that's funny. They understand that the parody that Susanita is this sort of girly girl who only cares about boys and when she first sees a ballistic missile, she says, oh, it looks just like a lipstick. And they understand that Felipe is sort of in love with Mafalda, who doesn't quite realize, and Manolito is the epitome of sort of capitalism.
Yes, he works for his father's business, right?
Yeah.
And he's always talking about the business aspect.
Yeah, this is why, Mafalda said, why didn't you go to kindergarten? And he said, because I'm much more help in my father's store. She said, well, that means you're not going to go to elementary school. And he said, oh, no. I'll go to elementary school because, that's about maths, and maths is important, and that's about money, and money is about progress. And she says, no. Progress is about, traveling into space. It's not your father's store. And he said, well, I'm interested in space too. I'm thinking of some satellite stores. But these are archetypes that all children understand in the same way. Susanita is friends with these people, but, she likes to be the lady. She knows that her parents have more money, and she hates, the whole idea of poverty is something that she just finds repulsive. And of course, these people aren't poor. I mean, Mafalda's father, works, he has a job, they earn enough money. But at some point, she said to Mama and says, Susanita was mean to me, and she said about us being poor. And Mama says, if anyone ever says that to you again, just tell them that your father works hard, your papa works hard, so we can live decently. Mafalda says, live decently. are there any sadder words in the language? Because, of course, what she means is they're scraping by. They're just about getting there, you know.
But how Latin American of her? Like
Oh, of
how?
course. Yeah. Of course. No, I think actually for children, the surprising things are going to be things like how shocked Mafalda is when they get their first television. Because
Right.
most children of Mafalda's age barely watch television. They have phones and iPads and screens.
Right.
And again,
Right.
I mean, obviously, Mafalda, as we discover, is very much a fan of the Beatles. Does it matter whether the kids who are reading it now care
Like
about the Beatles?
or not?
Not particularly.
Who do you expect to be the audience for the English version of Mafalda? Do you expect in the United States that more kids will read it?
I think what will probably happen, as frequently happens with strip cartoons, is that they are put out there and marketed to kids and end up being read by adults.
Mm-hmm.
It is not as though the mark of a great strip cartoon, as opposed to, a comic book or whatever, which may be targeted at a very specific audience. I think that a great strip cartoon actually not only does, but has to appeal to people across the board. I think that has important philosophical and political lessons for most of the adults in the United Kingdom and America and Australia and Canada and wherever, whoever has not yet read her. As much as she has, fun and freedom to communicate to children, and that sort of innate curiosity that you never stop asking, what is this? Why is this? How does this work? I mean, even if it's just about soup and her loathing of soup. And again, part of this is also has a context in the 1960s. In Argentina, it wasn't entirely scarce, but people were relatively poor. Then actually, soup is something that you had every day.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you had nothing else, you definitely had soup. And so, as a kid, maybe you didn't like soup because
Right.
there was no getting away from soup. In the same way
Right.
that, when we were young, we were told to eat our greens. But actually, in Ireland, we were told to eat soup because, again, soup is... It's easy to make. It's mostly water, and therefore it's fairly cheap and you can feed a lot of people with. No, I do think that, again, what you get from Mafalda is different because you're older, because you now understand that actually, if you have children, things are complicated to explain to them. It's not easy to protect them. It's not easy to say,
Yeah.
well, this is what a war is, and these are the good guys and these are the bad guys.
I have a 6 and a 4-year-old
Yeah,
at
exactly.
home asking me exactly the same questions.
Yeah, no.
We are all talking about so many issues here that you were putting in context when Quino was writing this. But what is the significance of translating and publishing Mafalda in English at this political moment right now in 2025?
Okay,
Everything.
maybe you've missed it, but authoritarian governments are on the rise pretty much everywhere. And the right wing has had a resurgence in the United Kingdom, in Europe generally, in the United States, and of course in Latin America. There may not be a war currently going on in Vietnam, but there is one in Gaza, there is one in Ukraine. None of this has changed. Notions of what freedom is and what censorship is. I mean, we are now saying in supposedly liberal democracies, you cannot say this thing. You cannot criticize this person
Right.
or this policy. If you do this, we will arrest you, deport you. We will, I mean, nothing that Quino faced at the time has gone away. It's just moved around a little bit. And we pretend that we're better than we used to be. But actually, human beings are human beings. And you could, if I had chosen to, simply changed a few words here and there, changed Vietnam to Ukraine or changed whatever, and made it sound as though it had been written last week. The delivery of a television the size of a small house would still be a problem. But, my advice to translators has always been, since you cannot be right, you might as well be wrong creatively. I mean,
Right.
Gunter Grass said, obviously, but in German, translation is where everything changes so that everything remains the same.
That's beautiful. Frank, I saw that all the volumes are supposed to come out in
Oh,
the
yes.
next
Yeah, yeah.
years. Is this volume one?
That's volume 1. I'm just finishing volume 2 now. That will come out at the end of the year. I will have finished volume 3 by September,
Wow.
October. So, yeah, within about 3 years, 4 years, we should have
I
everything.
I feel you adopted Mafalda. Do you meet her every day? Do you
Oh, yes.
encounter with her
Of
every
course.
day?
Of course. And actually, the more time you spend with, the more you know who they are. And one of the things,
Mm,
again, one of the things about translation is so that, you don't translate something and then just leave it. You will do it, and then you'll come back and you'll revise it a second time, and you'll come back a third time and think, that doesn't quite work. And the last time I go through something, I stop looking at the original, whether it's Spanish or French or
right.
whatever, and I just think, my character say this, because this is now
Mm,
my character. Yes, I know
right.
it is Quino's character, but she's now in my head. I need to know, will she say this? Does it make sense for Felipe say something like this? Because actually he
Right.
is this kind of person, not that kind of person. The important is that you keep the individual voices of each of the individual characters so that you know this is what they sound like. She's a bit tired and she's a bit optimistic, but she's trying, Papa is really despairing, and it's like, when Mafalda comes and says, Papa, can I ask you a question? No, 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 no. Because every time you ask me a question, it only leads to trouble. And Mafalda says, okay, I'll go away and I'll just leave you to wonder what question I was going to ask. And then, of course, he's like terrified and
How
panicked.
cruel.
Yeah, exactly. The longer you spend with them, the more you inhabit them. You know who they are. They spent that time living inside your head, and you spent that time living inside their head. So, yeah.
Right. I think it's fair to expect that readers who will now come to know Mafalda, your Mafalda in English, maybe wondered also after all the volumes, where do they go from here? Given your experience, the work that you've done, what do you recommend that people read next after they enjoy Mafalda?
Oh, that's incredibly difficult. I mean, because on the one hand, you have strip cartoons themselves, many of which are wonderful. You have, as I said, things like the graphic novels of Alberto Breccia in Argentina, or Peter
Hmm.
Bagg, or Dan Clowes in the United States, which again, I mean, they're much more something aimed at people in their teens. But also you have a lot of novels that play with childlike sensibilities and a sense of wonderment. There is a novel I translated, an Argentinian novel I translated many years ago by Marcelo Figueras, Kamchatka, which takes place during the disappearances during the Black Decade. Seen entirely from the point
Right.
of
Of
a
a
little
child.
boy who's 10
Yeah.
and his little brother, the midget. And
Also became a movie
it was made into a
with
movie, yes.
Larin, with
Yeah,
Ricardo Larin. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And those, I mean, and the child in Kamchatka is very similar. When he has to
Mm,
devise a riverboard so that the frogs don't drown in the swimming
I'm
pool, and
sure.
he frequently gets things wrong or mistakes things because he's not old enough to properly understand the world, but nonetheless, he's enormously curious to understand the world and what it is. And of course, I mean, this is a deeply political novel in which politics are never mentioned. We never
Okay.
know what happens to anyone. Even at the very end, we don't quite know. But while it's happening, it's kind of a little summer adventure on a finca in the countryside, and he has no sense of what it means.
They're actually going to the countryside. His family is actually running away from
They're
Argentina,
running away
right?
because they're likely to get arrested. And of course it's called Kamchatka because of the game of Risk. So
Hmm.
in Risk, on the board, which is a map of the world, Kamchatka is
Hmm.
the farthest place away
Okay.
from Argentina on the board. And his father, when he plays, usually tries to colonize Kamchatka first and then move out from there. But also in his mind as a child, it has become a symbol of somewhere where you go in order to be calm and to be quiet and to deal with the things that have happened to you.
Okay.
It's an extraordinary novel. After
Right.
that, it just becomes impossible. I mean, at some level, what Mafalda does is what Saint-Exupéry does with The Little Prince. You have, a small child who just asks questions. So the very first question is, what is this? And it's a drawing of a hat. No, it's not. It's an elephant that's been swallowed by an anaconda. And then he draws it again. You can see the elephant inside the anaconda. But again, that's about dreaming and magic and wonder. There is a vast tradition of stories which, though notionally child-centered, in fact, are about very adult themes. One of my favorite children's books, which needs to be read by adults, even if they read it as a child, is a novel by Russell Hoban called The Mouse and His Child, where the mouse and his child are two little wind-up toys that are attached together, and when you wind them up, they dance. But in the toy shop at night, all of the toys are alive. Now, the mouse can never let go of the child. And this is about freedom. It is about war. It is about belonging. It is about all sorts of things. Any great piece of children's literature can be read by anyone up to, 180. Children's literature simply examines exactly the same things that all literature explores. It simply does it usually with a child at its center, which allows it to identify with it.
Frank, this has been one of the most delightful interviews, and I really, really appreciate your time and the beauty that you put into all those answers. So thank you so much.
Okay, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening. I'm Luisa Lemi, and it's been a pleasure being your host for this season. Latin American Focus will take a North America summer break now, but Karen Zissis and I will be back in September with new episodes on the latest trends in Latin American politics, economics, and culture. This podcast is also produced by Fabricio Ricalde, Kalia Robertson, and Chase Harrison. I'm the executive producer of the show. The music in this episode was the classic milonga El Conventillo, performed by the Chúcara Trio. You also listened to Argentine harmonica player Santiago Álvarez. These were performed for America Society in Casa series. Find out about upcoming concerts in New York and what's coming to our YouTube channel at musicoftheamericas.org. And if you like the soundtrack of this podcast and Latin American culture, consider becoming a member of America Society. We'll drop a link on the notes for you to learn more. If you listen up to here, check out other episodes of Latin American Focus in our website, www.as-coa.org/podcast, or write us an email telling us what you would like to hear about. Share with other Latin America aficionados and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members.